As you know, folks, this session is being recorded, and that's what we're doing right now, figuring that out. Like I was telling Katy here, that's not my deal, so it doesn't stress me very much. But we are about 10 minutes after the posted presentation time. We have a quite full schedule. We'll let you know like the airline pilots do. We'll try to make time in the air, but we will... And then I'm holding this clicker precariously, just like so the laser doesn't get disrupted, so I can use it when I'm walking around. So there's a few elements that we're working with here. How are we looking on our recording? Are we good and ready? Well, very good. I guess we can get started then. Before we do, actually, Katy and I were talking here earlier, and we were like, okay, we'll probably have like 5-10 people in this, end of conference session about conflict management at centers, and we were going to talk to you, the 5-10 people individually, about why you're here, etc. But we'll do it a little differently here in a moment. But if you're here for "It's okay to disagree, or is it?" session, then you're in the right place.
So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Katy Schroeder. I'm an assistant professor at Texas Tech University. I also direct the Equine Assisted Counseling and Wellness Lab that is a part of our premier accredited PATH Center on campus. And I actually am a TRI as well and an equine specialist with PATH. And I'm going to cut that short so we can make up time in the end.
Right. Look at our lovely pictures. I'm Nina Ekholm. I'm at University of Denver. I'm the director of equine programs at our Institute for Human-Animal Connection. And you see my 3 areas of work here. When it comes to human-horse interactions, I work both in the therapeutic sense. I lead our postmaster's equine-assisted mental health practitioner program. I also work with horses in communities, which involve their welfare, their behavior, and I interact with our field, our industry, in a number of ways, also as a registered TRI and as an ESMHL as well. But these are some of the groups and associations that I work with or work for in a number of ways. So, Katy, why are we here? For me, I'm interested in the conflicts that I would say naturally arise in a complex center setting, because I want to make sure that both people and horses get good outcomes. And when there's conflicts between people, horses tend to get squished in between, sometimes literally, but mostly figuratively. And my special angle or interest here is in neurobiology and regulation. I'm very interested in our capacity to function when our arousal level gets a little too high, and how we should be paying more attention to this, both when it comes to humans and horses.
And over the years, as I developed as a professional in this field, and my education went further and further, and then I started to take the role of teacher, instructor, and helping other students, I realized that we were going to, or I actually experienced these interesting conflicts where we would get into even value clashes, especially when it involved a paradigm shift, like the way we think about equine welfare 20 years ago and how we think about equine welfare now and the knowledge that we've gained. And so even in the barn, as an instructor in the past and then teaching students at Texas Tech, I needed to walk into a conversation to be prepared in a different way, to understand my own hot buttons, the hot topics for me, how that was going to impact me physiologically, and how I approached having a difficult conversation with someone else or teaching them a new concept that they might not be ready to take in yet. How many folks have experienced that before? Yeah, it's challenging. And so, my stake in this is and we're going to talk about the strategies later, these strategies have been useful to me in navigating difficult conversations and staying in a grounded, neutral place to have empathy for the other person, as well as advance our dialogue forward.
So today, that's Bonnie and Clyde, by the way. So today, we will do the following. We will present you with an experiential about a particular conflict, perhaps one that you have been either a party to in terms of actively or a bystander even. We're going to talk a little bit about barriers to conflict resolution briefly, because our whole idea here with this limited hour is just to expose you to a few things, a few concepts, a few strategies, a few things to think about, and we will also have you talk to each other a little bit about this. A couple of concepts, the ladder of inference. The ladder, one of my favorites. We'll talk about the window of tolerance briefly too. Talk about tools and strategies related to motivational interviewing, which is one of Katy's areas of specialization. And we will wrap up with talking about a learning culture. What does this mean when we intentionally think about a learning culture in our settings? But to start us off, as promised, this is why we had all this hoopla with our clicker and our microphone and all of this. You will meet two center staff members in a moment here. So we named them differently than ourselves. We have therapeutic, and we chose pictures that we don't typically use for our presentations, etc. Just to create a little distance here. We have the therapeutic riding instructor and Special Olympics equestrian coach, Carla. We have equine manager, Sophie. And you will both hear what they say to each other, and I will do my best to click forth the text on the screen so you can also read it, especially with my Swedish-speaking Finn accent, so you don't miss anything. Let's go. Somebody swing this out. And we will be reading off our scripts.
So I need to start getting the horses cleaned up for the show. I'll plan on shaving their bridle paths and muzzles and trimming their feathers. I'll get some of the riders involved, but I'll take responsibility for getting it done. I figured it would help you out a bit with everything going on right now.
Okay. I will ask you to not shave their muscles, though.
Why?
So
I've never seen a horse have a problem with it. They're used to getting shaved, the shaving around their nostrils. You know, I've shown horses all my life, and I would never go into the ring without a properly trimmed horse. Besides, we owe our Special Olympics riders. We need to do right by them for their competitions too.
Well, of course I care about our riders. What I'm saying is that we're not going to be shaving the horse's muscles, not here on site, not for competitions. It's not about you and your competition career. It's about the horses.
Well, this is a riding program issue, not a management issue. So I'll do what's best for our riders.
Well, there's actually nothing in the Special Olympics rules about trimming whiskers. You know, the tactile hairs on the face.
How would you know? You're not a coach. Are you even a TRI?
Well, it's not like the competition rules are secret. Anyway, you might not be aware that the whiskers, or vibrissae, the tactile hairs, are essential to the horse. They each have nerve endings, and through them, the horse can detect objects close to their nose and eyes, and also vibrations in the air. They're organs of touch. They're really important to those who care about horse welfare.
Yeah, but our riders are not going to steer into anything under my direction, okay? I assure you. Anyway, I'm going to talk to the program director about this since this is a competition issue.
Well, it's actually a horse welfare.
I have to go teach class.
All right, turn to your neighbor. Just a few moments. What just happened? Turn and chat to your neighbor.
Do we want to ask a few people to say anything or no?
No, I think we'll just trek on, actually.
Maybe we'll end up.
And this is just to get them kind of involved a little bit. Let's see where we are in time. I know, you can go out. I have to stay here with this motherfucker. I mean, it's pretty good. So we're 2:52 and we're at human factor now. So we made timing here.
We did. We're doing well. Now we have to rein them in.
Yes, I know. Are you ready? Are you ready for that? Do you want to now?
Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead and start finishing that sentence. Final sentence. Put a period on the sentence. No commas, just period. That looked like a lively discussion. And I want you to keep Carla and Sophie in mind. You're going to see them again. And with the content that we're going to go through now, I want you to start taking that, putting it, as we say in Swedish, behind your ear or in your backpack, because you'll see them again. So I want you to be able to analyze them and see what choices they make this time around. But just briefly, wanted to start with talking about barriers to conflict resolution. And as with everything and anything, it's the human factor that is the barrier here. And a few features. We're both mental health professionals. We're both social scientists. So we're interested in these particular barriers. And as I mentioned earlier, these barriers are also barriers for our horses, for them being understood, their welfare, their behavior, etc. So a feature of humans, we are meaning-making machines. I don't know if you've noticed this, that if you want something justified, you can get it justified. You can find even research studies to justify your unpopular opinion. It is, whether it's good or not research, that's another thing. But because of this, we make attribution errors frequently. We make attribution errors. They could be, as a kid, oh, I didn't step on any cracks today, so my family's house didn't burn down. Great. We attribute things to the wrong things. So we can't always trust our ability to justify. We have a strong need for emotional comfort, and we claim that emotional comfort feels the same way as physical comfort does. It's the same feeling, intensity. And here's an interesting concept, cognitive dissonance. So new information that conflicts with what we already know can be a bit challenging. Here's a Dilbert to explain this. So coworker says, if your numbers are correct, my strategic plan is irrational. Spoink, cognitive dissonance takes over. You sure are bad with numbers. And then Dilbert says, what was that noise? Because that didn't fit his worldview either about being bad with numbers. So in other words, here's a little more technical overview. The essence of cognitive dissonance is that there's an inconsistency between your actions and your beliefs. So you seek to consolidate them, either through changing your action, through changing your belief about the action, or change your perception about the action you're taking. Three very tricky things. It might be hardest to do the thing in the middle, especially if we've been used to doing something. I'm sure folks in the audience here have made changes to their eating, to their life in some ways where you ran into this kind of thing. So, and I want to know how many know that this is true, that for humans, repeating statements, whether they're true or not, can bring comfort to us, especially when we're in a group. Am I not right? No? Yes, thank you so much. Yes. So, this is a factor too. What's the environment, the culture we're in? I teach dissent to my postmaster students and my graduate students. The legal definition of having an opinion other than the majority opinion, the focus there being opinion. So a lot of times when we really focus on equine welfare, we find ourselves with a dissenting opinion than the majority. So it's important to know that there's a category for this as well. And how many of you know about this thing? Humans often let loyalty to a person supersede new or changing information. Yep, I heard somebody say very loudly. So in other words, it's Kathy's bucket thing. So now we can't change this because it's her deal, at the center, even though we know that there's new and changing information that actually makes the bucket thing outdated or downright not appropriate. So it's important to have some awareness of this, and that's the theme now of this unit of information that I'm going to present. I'm going to present two concepts, and then Katy will present on her area of expertise. But what all of these things have in common is that they help us reveal our decision-making processes, our justifications for our own feelings, or I just feel that this is right, or I just think it's this way. So here we have the ladder of inference, a concept by Chris Arguris, developed by Peter Senge. And I really like the ladder. We will break the ladder down here in a moment. I know there's a lot of aspects to it, but in its essence, it helps us deconstruct the steps we take in a split second when we make decisions, when we make inferences, observations and inferences about something. So here's the core ladder here. The process of observing, selecting, attributing meaning, making assumptions about this, drawing conclusions, adding beliefs, and then taking action, and then all the way back around. So we have a self-sustaining cycle here. So we start in any situation as humans through observable data and experiences. The problem is we're not a machine. So we already have a filter on what we pay attention to. Classic is if I asked you to pay attention in this room to all the things that are green in the room, if I asked you, just write down as many as possible, and then I trick you into asking about something that's purple. And you're like, oh, purple, I didn't see any of that. So classic, right? So it's important to know that even when we're taking in data from the environment, it can already be affected by our perceptive loops. We're never without a position, ever. So then with some filters already, we start selecting data from what we observe. So as I'm going through this ladder, you can think about Sophie and Carla. They went up a ladder when it came to shaving of tactile hairs and selected very different information. So as we go up, think about those two. But then after you have your senses taken information, your unconscious brain is making some determinations, and then you also do some manual selecting. But then you start adding meanings to what you're taking in. This we can see very clearly in our interpersonal interactions. You kind of start seeing, is there a need for self-protection here? I'm wondering, because we're at a conference, if you've been chatting with people perhaps you don't even know, and it's a somewhat friendly environment here at the PATH International Conference, but I wonder if you've had some of these things happening, a little bit like, ooh, is this person okay? Do I have to not be a little guarded with what I share? Right? So we start adding meaning through our own experiences with people, through the setting we're in, right? And then, and this is the worst part, or maybe, I start making assumptions based on the meanings I've attributed, which could be different from somebody else's reality completely. This gets very tricky when we are talking about horses, because can also be about the motivations or the intent of other people. With horses we do this. We apply human thinking, human intent to horses. And then we get into a bit of a tricky situation where we're over here making decisions about whether or not to use the crop on the horse, where the horse is over here without any intent of, what you might be attributing to them, and actually might need another saddle fitting or something. So horses can get at risk. There's a good side to anthropomorphism because we can really assume that we're very much almost the same as horses, with one exception of the learning and intent, the medial prefrontal. But when it comes to our basic feelings, experiences of pain, pleasure, stress, we can use our anthropomorphism to go, that's right. I'm not different from this pig or horse or dog or cat. So there's an upside to it. But anyway, as one then finishes the ladder, then you draw conclusions based on the assumptions that you have made about that person you met in the hallway here. It must be this way, because then our minds can settle. I've settled on this one thing from all the 1,000 different things. So then we can feel quite certain about this, and we hold this belief quite hard, quite solidly. And then you start adopting beliefs, and they can then either reinforce your belief, these new people, or these people from the East Coast, or the West Coast, or the South, or the Northwest, or whoever you've run into, they're like this. Tried to make that very spread out and democratic, but it could either reinforce then old things, which is easy. Okay, just reinforce that I like people from Virginia. That's my thing. Or forming new things. That's the challenging parts. That's the cognitive dissonance, or how we, can lead to cognitive dissonance, or how we, accommodate or assimilate new information. The point is here that it feels hard. We might not even access it, but it's not easy. But then you take actions based on your beliefs. You either, like Carla, take this thing to the horse's face like this, and or, like Sophie, you don't. So you went up the ladder, and you do this almost with every moment that you're making decisions, determinations, sometimes out of consciousness. So some takeaway points here from the ladder. The idea is to become more aware of my own thinking and reasoning, so it's not hidden from me. So I don't just run up the ladder and run back down, and I can't make sense of my life in some ways because I don't have access to this. It also helps us to start inquiring more into others' thinking and reasoning, or in the horse's case, into the horse's reality and behavior, instead of just running up our own ladder. Inquiry. Maybe I ask, maybe I follow up with this person if I felt something was a little weird, and maybe I learn ways to do that, which we will, that can really not feel threatening, not kick in their sense of self-protection and reinforce their deal with us. We have limited control over others, but we can try. And the third thing is making my thinking and reasoning more visible to others. I can now all of a sudden really stand, I can show this is my reasoning for this equine issue or for this personnel issue, because it's transparent. I can show you why I took these steps. I can show you what data I selected, etc. Suppose it's just this way, and I don't have time, I gotta go teach a lesson. And I want you to then just think to yourselves about how do you implement this then in decision-making in your program? Could the ladder be part of an intentional learning culture where decisions made in the program sort of follow a ladder-like? It doesn't have to be this particular ladder of inference, but that way, people can see the reasoning and they can then challenge perhaps the reasoning at a certain point in the ladder. Something like that. Very briefly, before I hand it over to Katy, in conjunction with this, I started talking a little bit about that moment where we start feeling a little guarded. Maybe there's a need for self-protection. And I'm not talking, hands up and that kind of thing, but just an emotional state of, I noticed something. I'm going to be a little more alert. So this is my area, as I mentioned, of interest and passion, the neurobiology of capacity. And you might have noticed some of it already between Carla and Sophie here, their body languages, the choices they made. We had to stand very close to each other because of the microphone. It was almost a little uncomfortable because of the intensity of the exchange, right? So that's something to really take with you as we go into our next demo in a moment here. But at the most, I wanted to show you two images. At the most basic level, our state of mind or our emotions function this way. There's some sort of evaluation or appraisal, typically happens outside of consciousness. A lot of these processes like sweating or cooling your body down or these kind of internal processes happen outside of consciousness. But something comes in, some sort of activation happens neurochemically, which eventually leads to our state. Our state of mind has a body sensation part, has a thought part. And the tricky part of it is that it affects how we experience ourselves and the world. So let's hear who's hangry, who gets hungry anger. Okay, we got, yes, so many. Well, we're close to lunch. Who gets canger, cold anger? Gets angry when you're cold? Yes, that's my deal. I don't get hangry at all, I get hangry. So all of a sudden how these biostates can totally change you. Your thinking even, your reasoning, your kindness to others. So it can either be body-driven or thought-driven, but it does affect how you experience yourself and the world, so your state is very important because it can mess up your reasoning, your thinking, and you also want to make yourself optimal, in an optimal state for what you're going to do. I do that quite a lot. If I'm going to do a hard task, I pull up a file on my computer where I save notes from folks who, I've worked with, or somebody attended my lecture, or something like that. And it's some nice, little note like, that was so great, and I really enjoyed it. So I save all of them. And then I read through them, and then I go, wow, great. What you shouldn't do in a repressed society. But I do. I do, and then I take that state of mind of not feeling any sense of self-protection, need for self-protection or threat, and then I attack the very difficult task from a state that's not already in the kind of liminal zone of tension. So I like this. It can help us design ourselves for our most optimal things. But the image that I really wanted to focus on is the window of tolerance. And it can be depicted many ways. This is a term used a lot in the somatic or body-related psychology world. And it looks nothing like this. This is just a drawing, right? But it's a way to make the intangible tangible in some ways. And when we're outside, the idea is that when we're inside, we're in sort of one general state. When we're outside, past the barriers there, we're in a different state. But we don't have just one window, just like our horses. This applies to all social mammals. Don't just have one window either. It's state, there's the word, state dependent. When you're hangry, you have a smaller window of capacity. And within that window, when you're in it, you have full access to your cognitive capacities, like saying, let's take a little break. Let's count to 5 quietly before I just rip the cupboard open here and bang somebody in the head in the volunteer lounge, And we're also flexible and adaptive. We can have response flexibility. We can think, I don't have to respond the same way to everything. I can make choices that are adaptive, that work for the situation. But again, the situation, there might be situations you are tolerating less. There might be states where your window gets more narrow. So the important, interesting thing is the edges. If we can catch ourselves before we hit the edge, we can help ourselves come back down into that window of that, I now have access. Like literally, electricity in your brain will reroute when you hit the edge of your window. But if you know what it feels like when you start getting up there, you can bring yourself down by taking a break or engaging with somebody or whatever strategy might work. And sometimes life puts us outside of our window. We go boop, and we hopefully come back down. And I didn't want to focus very much on this, so I'll click through it. But when we're outside of our window, we don't have access to the same cognitive capacities. The same is true for horses. And we are instead in this kind of cascade, where as humans we start with social engagement, and then we don't always go through each step, because humans tend to do what's worked in the past. So I wish we would talk more about this, but it's just to say that when we're outside, you see those orange arrows, when you're outside your window, you're talking to somebody, they're not going to take in information about the tactile hairs. They are not in a position to be sensing anything other than uncomfortable, fear, anger, that kind of thing. So that's why paying attention to somebody's arousal, somebody's state, will be important, because they might not be telling you this, and our horses definitely are not like, I think I'm approaching my window. They won't say it in English, but they will say it with their body language, and that's our responsibility. And I wanted to offer that when we're curious, this is true for horses too, we view challenging situations more creatively. We have less defensive reaction to stress. In other words, we can stay within our window a little better if we can turn the situation around. That instead of us feeling threatened, I can be curious about, oh, what's the other person going to say? I'm interested. But you have to truly be. Otherwise, it's just words, right? So, and that the same goes for horses. Approach conditioning is a habituation process where we roll the wheelbarrow away from the horse, and the horse follows, and eventually it's like, oh, this thing is moving away from me as opposed to moving toward me. I wonder why that is. So I use approach conditioning some when I do hoof work with an angle grinder. Scary stuff for horses sometimes. But what are then, so those were two concepts I want you to keep behind your ear. What are tools and techniques that can then change the dynamics of the interaction from earlier? So those are just things for us to kind of, what I talked about, the strategies for us to notice, but what are some actual things perhaps to say even to help that interaction go a little differently?
If the mouse touches the desk, it will stop working. So that is what, it's true. Okay. So I just want to reiterate what Nina said about knowing and understanding your window and your edges. You need to know yours first before you engage somebody in a difficult conversation, because you need to know when your arousal level is going to get higher. And then what the previous slide had, that word curious, that is one way to take your arousal level down, staying and being curious. And that is, personally, that has helped me immensely. And so what I'd like to share with you now is a particular strategy called motivational interviewing. And it was, this is, I feel, the best way to capture it, a collaborative discussion for strengthening a person's internal motivation and commitment to change. So when you need to engage someone in a conversation about making a change, how can you work with that person to help them develop the internal motivation to make a particular change, and that it's coming from within, and that they are, in motivational interviewing we say, arguing for their own change, rather than you imposing your beliefs on them or what you want from them, or trying to manipulate them into making a change. And that's very, very important. So the strategies that we're going to talk about and demonstrate to you are not meant to persuade somebody to adopt a different viewpoint. and they're not to manipulate somebody to do what you want them to do. So I wanted to make that very clear. This approach was originally developed as a person-centered counseling intervention by William Miller and Stephen Rolnick, and it has since expanded out to different areas of human health care and always related to behavioral change, organizational development, so team building, teamwork, communication, and most recently, and this is where I got really excited, into veterinarian practice. So researchers are looking at, if I teach veterinarians these MI skills, will they be able to help their clients adopt particular changes for the welfare of their animals? And that fits beautifully with what we are doing too, as we teach each other about equine welfare, about client welfare, and many other topics that we discuss on a daily basis with each other at our centers. So we're going to give you the Cliff Notes version, the snapshot of MI, and the foundational skills of MI are applicable to any type of communication in which you need to get through a difficult dialogue. And the core principles are to always express empathy, to come from a place of empathy for the other person, their lived experience, and their viewpoint. So Sophie, finding a way, digging deep to connect with what's going on for Carla and why she might be really set on shaving the horse's whiskers. Helping develop discrepancies between actions and goals. Sometimes it's below our level of awareness that what we are doing does not actually fit with our values or the goals we have, sometimes. And we might not be aware of that. And so part of this conversation is how do we become more aware of which actions might not actually fit with our ultimate goals, with our values and beliefs. It's really important for someone engaging MI skills to roll with what it's called rolling with the resistance. So avoid arguing. Once we start to butt heads with each other, we both shut down. We don't get very far when we start to argue. And supporting the other person's self-efficacy. So how can Sophie support Carla's self-efficacy, her leadership, in making these decisions about what she's going to be doing when she takes the riders to this competition and how she prepares her horses. And again, very applicable to, I believe, with past centers when we're working oftentimes in a very egalitarian teamwork model where we're sharing responsibility and decision making. This is extremely important that people in their individual roles feel empowered in their roles to make decisions. And there's some very core principles in practice, and we call these oars. And you can think of oars on a rowboat. These are how you get where you need to go. Open-ended questions are extremely valuable. This keeps the conversation going. Affirmations, what you notice in listening to the other person about the positives. So we'll be showing you an example of Sophie finding the positives with Carla. Reflecting what you hear. And some of this is actually what we learned at the very beginning of, for instance, counselor education, our basic helping skills sequence. Reflecting back that you understood how they were feeling, that you understand what they're thinking about, and that you are getting the meaning behind what they're conveying to you. It's extremely important and really helpful to keep the conversation going. And summaries. So if you can bring together and summarize what someone has told you, they get to hear you say it, they get to think about it, they get to tell you if that's accurate or not. And again, you're building an understanding between each other. So letting people know that you're taking it all in and you're putting it together, and then they can let you know, okay, are we on the same page yet? Again, conversation can't move forward if you aren't staying in sync with each other, if you're not coming alongside each other. And then as a conversation moves forward, you're using your oars, you're listening for change talk. So that is when somebody is starting to talk or think about doing something different. So that's any verbalization that indicates a person's desire, need, ability, or commitment to making a particular change. And one way to remember this is darn cat, and I'm going to tell you what that acronym means. Kitty. Meow. Meow. So we think of there's I know, the meow. Okay. Preparatory change talk and mobilizing change talk. So there's getting ready to make a change, and people will say specific statements to that end. And then there's mobilizing change talk. I am doing things and I'm actually changing. So preparatory change talk, you'll hear desires, that somebody feels they have the ability to make a change, that they have specific reasons for why they want to change, not why you think they should change, but that they are generating this from within, and that they feel that there is actually a need to change. So you're listening for these things in your conversations. And then mobilizing is commitment, actuation, and taking those steps. So I will make a change, I'm going to do this, I'm doing this tomorrow. So it's very clear that that change is about to happen. And so you can actually elicit change talk or evoke change talk by taking the conversation to a place where we explore extremes. So what would be the worst case scenario if you did not shave the horse's whiskers? What might happen? Tell me about it. I want to understand your point of view. Explore and ask about a person's goals and values. Really important. I don't do this often enough. I don't take time to just sit back and, okay, where did this come from? And as a previous 3-day eventer, I can tell you that the whiskers got shaved every horse show. And I came from that world, and that's what I did. And so part of this is very much grounded in my own previous experiences. And there's a lot around that. There's a lot around why I did that and why it was expected that I do that. Use open-ended questions. Can't emphasize this enough. And explore the pros and cons. What would happen if you didn't do this? What would happen if you did this? And so just to recap this, keeping the lines of communication open, start with your ors, use your ors. Really, really important. Listen for change talk during the conversation. And that's important because if you don't hear any change talk or even ambivalence, the person's maybe considering but not quite sure, you can't keep going. You got to keep doing the ors. You got to keep trying to understand their point of view. And the same is going for them as well. And then as you're hearing change talk come forth, then you can evoke it by asking more questions and eliciting maybe those pros and cons and open-ended questions. So all of this is to head off that immediate argument where nobody gets anywhere. And it's asking you to take a step back and be very curious about what's going on for the other person. Okay. Oh, don't touch it.
Put the laser down.
Let's
see what we're on time. Perfect. Okay. So, and I want you to really look at where does the conversation start shifting. And because this is just a short session, we've actually added in, that you'll see on the transcript, some of those instances of ors and change talk. You'll see them marked, so you don't have to remember all those acronyms, but darn cat, meow, was pretty easy to remember, right? So we start out then with Carla and Sophie. We start out in the same place. Sorry. Also pay attention to their states and their bodies.
I need to start getting the horses cleaned up for the show. I'll plan on shaving their bridle pads and muzzles and trimming feathers. I'll get some of the riders involved, but I'll take responsibility for getting it done. I figured that would help you out a bit with everything going on.
Okay, I will ask you to not shave their muscles, though.
Why not?
So,
I've never seen a horse have a problem with it. They get used to it, the shaving around their nostrils. You know, I've shown horses all my life, and I would never go into the ring without properly trimmed up horses. Besides, we owe our Special Olympic riders. We need to do right by them in their competition, too.
it sounds like you have a concern that it would be maybe embarrassing to show up at the competition without the horses properly turned out.
For sure. I don't want our riders to lose points or be teased by other riders for the horses' appearances.
I can totally see that you care so much about our riders. You want to help them do their best. I'm hearing that you're worried about negatively impacting their showing experience.
I am, yeah.
Sorry, we can't go back apparently with this, but it says, what other concerns do you have?
Well, to tell you the truth, it would also reflect badly on me as the coach and our center. Like I said before, shaving whiskers is standard practice in horse showing.
I understand where you're coming from, and you're representing our center. You don't want to be criticized for something like this.
Yeah, I don't really think it's that big of a deal.
Let me see if I'm getting it. Your primary concern is that since this is a horse show, it's expected that the horses be properly turned out. Not trimming the horse's whiskers would open the riders up to judgment by others and wouldn't reflect well on our center either. Perhaps you might also be a little frustrated with me telling you to not trim their whiskers.
Yeah, that's it in a nutshell, yep.
So, what was this comment? Oh, yeah, so a little later, the conversation is flowing, and Sophie determines that it's the right time to ask Carla if she could share a little information about the horse's tactile hairs, about the whiskers. And because of how things were flowing, it seemed, Carla said she would like to hear some, and it wasn't just a placating answer. And in that process then, Sophie offered some information about tactile hairs. She talked about the horse's accommodation process in the eyes, that they can't focus on details that are really close to their head. She talked about the skull size of horses, the length of the nose, and how this blocks visual access unless the horse is in a grazing position with their head straight down. Because of course horses have to see what's in front of them. The problem is when their head comes up off the ground from that grazing position. Sophie also told Carla that the whiskers are actually organs of touch for horses. They have individual nerve endings. They're different than the mane and tail, but let's not forget that the mane is also sensitive. That's a different question. And that modifying tactile hairs or whiskers for competition or otherwise is outlawed in many European countries, like Germany, Switzerland, Sweden. And Sophie, who comes from Europe, thought long and hard about whether to introduce this fact, because that could cause some defensiveness, like that other continent, those other people. But she kind of took a risk because Sophie competed in show jumping and dressage in Europe, and no, she was never asked to shave the tactile hairs because she would have been fined and not allowed to compete if she had when going to competition. So that was our little interlude to kind of shorten it. So now we're going back into the dialogue.
Wow, that's all really interesting. The whiskers are there for a reason, I guess. I really do want to take their welfare into consideration. But I'm a bit conflicted. It's only one show. They'll be okay.
So you're unsure if shaving their whiskers this one time will be a problem. And earlier we talked about some of the cons of leaving whiskers on for the show. And I'm wondering if there could be some advantages to leaving the whiskers on.
Well, maybe. You said that horses need their whiskers for, well, hey, maybe that's why Jewel gets those scratches on her face. Maybe if I didn't trim her whiskers, she wouldn't get those. She'd be more relaxed. The rider would feel safer, and I would be a lot less stressed at the show. And the horses' well-being is really important to TRIs and coaches. Their welfare is really important to me.
And what would it be like then to have a conversation with your staff, the folks that you're responsible for, your staff and riders, about leaving the whiskers alone?
Well, I could explain this to the riders and their parents too even, but I can't control what others think when I get to the show, and that bothers me.
Yeah, sure, I understand that worry. And what would be the worst case scenario?
Well, maybe some looks and snide comments, but hey, that really says more about them than us. As far as the actual competition, I'll look at the rules again, and if there's nothing about the whiskers and the judge can't score the rider lower on the movement or on appearance because the whiskers aren't trimmed, so I guess I can be okay with not shaving their muzzles. I'll let the other staff and riders know tomorrow when they arrive here to help with preparing the horses.
That's great.
I agree.
So we did make some time while in the air because this is our kind of conclusion slide. So again, yeah, reflect on that just to yourselves. What happened there? You know, what were the changes that occurred? But we wanted to leave you with this concept, which sort of ties together what we talked about during this hour. The idea of a learning culture. And a learning culture focuses on ideas and not on persons. Because ideas are allowed to change and be wrong, but sometimes our long-term volunteer can't be wrong because then they might leave us in a pinch, and etc. So focus on ideas, not persons. Set that intention. Make your center have an intentional learning culture, and make sure that there's, explicit expectations and consistent corrections. I didn't put that on the slide, but explicit expectations, consistent corrections, so that your culture can be created and maintained. And related to the latter there, any decisions that are made about horses, about riders, about staff policies, make sure that they're visible, and by visible you could, again, be using a ladder or something, and open to being challenged by visible reasoning. So you ask folks to, if they have an issue with a policy, that they show, you create a structure for your center, that they show their reasoning going through that thing. And it's an exercise for them too to gather more information. And you might even find that once it's time for that meeting to talk about it, that they're like, actually, in thinking about this and researching my own thoughts, I think I agree with you. That kind of thing could even happen. But it's important that things are open to being challenged. And it's easier when it's not about us, but about the idea. And buy-in and self-carriage, borrowed from the equestrian world, is created through education. So not just, like Katy was saying, not just making the other person just comply with your sense of the information, but having them really understand it. So a little MI process there, motivational interviewing process, that they come to the information through themselves. I work in higher ed, and this is really how we operate. Here's information. I'll make this a little more likely, but it's really up to you to critically analyze what I'm saying and the sources I'm choosing to use. So in that way, you don't have to be there poking them all the time, just like you would never, with a horse, give them a leg cue every step. That doesn't help anybody, and it doesn't create self-carriage. And finally, intentionally employ these conflict management tools and strategies. They can be fun. We tried to make it fun today. You can do your own role plays. You can, bring this into your center culture. And for your own sanity, Katy touched upon this, make effort where your effort's effective. If the ORS are not working, the acronym ORS, if you're not getting anywhere, there's no change talk, there's no ambivalence, somebody is ambivalent, somebody's not showing any of those signs, it's not time yet to go to change. And in a center, you have to manage this depending on your role, if that person is actually violating some of your protocols. You have to manage that. But the idea is to bring folks along, not just to kind of shove them into compliance. Doesn't work with horses, doesn't work with people. And we're leaving you with this quote, which is misattributed to Mark Twain. It was not, and it's ironic that it is, because it's about that. So it's not. It wasn't Mark Twain. It was from a humor book in the 1800s. It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. The antithesis of a learning culture. Thank you so much.